Good afternoon, everyone. I always get up to this microphone and think nobody can hear me because it always sounds so quiet, but I guess you can hear me. It's March 21st, 2023, Democratic Caucus. Um, Thank you all for being understanding about the shift in time. We were trying to stagger lunches and trying to accommodate for all of you chairs in the room, the fact that you have actually witnesses coming and trying to get this all done smoothly as possible between the three different caucuses. So that's why we moved ours. Hope it works out for everyone today. I have a few announcements and a bunch of bills. So first of all, Melanie, I can't see out in this room well enough. Melanie, are you here? There you are. I just wanted to also do a second welcome. You had a wonderful welcome on the floor. Melanie Carpenter from Hyde Park, our new member. Thank you for being here, Melanie. We look forward to getting to know you. Yay. We're thrilled you're here. We now have 150 members in the House again, which is great. Okay, floor times, just quick update like usual. Same floor schedule, 1 and 9:30 on Friday, 1 tomorrow and Thursday, 9:30 and Friday. But just a quick reminder, our floor times are going to be long and expect them to be very long. Expect them to go either into dinner, or if they're going to be so long, we may break for dinner, but we probably will break for dinner in a way that we won't have you leave the State House, meaning the cafeteria will be open or we'll figure out something else. We're still working on that, trying to figure it out with all caucus leadership, but it will happen. And most especially Thursday. Thursday is going to be the longest day, I think. So I just wanted to make sure everybody had that heads up. Oh, and I also wanted to mention about floor, the order that you see in your calendar, don't get too hung up on that. We do move the order of the day around a lot, and you're going to start seeing that now. You're going to start seeing that tomorrow probably, and certainly on Thursday, where a bill may get bumped to later in the calendar or moved up even. So stay in touch if you're a bill reporter with leadership so that you know what's going on. I have to stay in touch with the speaker's office to know what's going on. So we just try to coordinate all that. Next Wednesday, we're going to have a caucus of the whole on the budget, like we always do. Just wanted to put that out there. I'm not actually sure of the time yet, but then budget's going to be up on Thursday and Friday. So I just wanted to give everybody that heads up. And oh, and one last notice, there will be a notice of at some point soon. I can't give you the date or the time, but it won't be until after crossover. But I just wanted to put it on your in your minds that the training that I've been mentioning about anti-discrimination, we are still planning on that. We're still working with who's going to take the lead on that training, but the date and time will be determined, but we will be doing that within the next few weeks. So, all right, that was it on mine announcements. If no one has anything else, I will turn it over first to Martin and his booth. And I don't know whether Lori wants to be a part of this or not, but anyway, Martin, on 230 suicide prevention, there's some changes and we wanted to update.
Good afternoon. House Judiciary has been taking, or did take, quite a bit of testimony on H230. Our focus was different than the Healthcare Committee. We focused on criminal law offenses, whether penalties were appropriate, whether terms were clear for prosecutors. And we also looked at court process, and this is especially true with respect to the red flag law or the extreme risk protection order law. And constitutionality was really one of the biggest issues that we spent quite a lot of time and heard quite a bit of testimony. The upshot on constitutionality, I could spend an hour talking about that, but I'm going to spend 30 seconds instead. The upshot is that we had strong arguments that these provisions are constitutional. We did have some arguments that they are not. Personally, I didn't find them nearly as persuasive. And importantly, we had the Vermont Attorney General come in and testify, and she said that she believes they are constitutional and they'll be ready to defend these provisions if necessary. So let me just go over the few major changes that we have that we put into the our strike all amendment. First of all, with respect to secure storage, there was a provision in the bill as we received it, that would have had a penalty of a fine of $100 if somebody had not securely stored their firearms, and children or prohibited persons. When I say prohibited persons, that's somebody who's not allowed to have a firearm, possess a firearm, if they are likely to be able to gain access. Whether or not access was gained or not, whether anything happened or not. And we struck that provision. And where we are now is if a unsecured firearm is accessed and misused, if it's used in a crime, if it's used in a threatening manner by a child or a prohibited person, or if they cause injury or death, that's where we have some significant criminal penalties that are imposed. The reason for that change primarily is that very difficult to enforce, and there was a lot of pushback in testimony and outside our committee that what does this mean, that you're going to have warrants to go and check if people have their firearms secure? People's privacy seems to be invaded, et cetera. So we struck that particular provision, and I think we're still sending a very strong message and have some pretty significant consequences if an unsecured firearm is in fact accessed and misused. The second thing we did was we actually changed the definition of injury with this secure storage law. The definition that the Healthcare Committee used, though I absolutely understand, it was very broad. It dealt with mental health, physical health, etc. But that's not the kind of injury that we recognize, particularly for a 5-year felony, which is what that injury was attached to. What we recognize in criminal law is serious bodily injury. So we've put in that definition for the type of injury that we're looking at. Moving on to the extreme risk protection order. So the extreme risk protection order, somebody can petition the court. Actually, they have to go through the current law, through the state's attorney. And if one can show, if the state's attorney can show that an individual is at extreme risk to themselves or others because of possession of firearms, that order can be entered, an extreme risk protection order can be entered, and the person would have to relinquish the firearms. We wanted to make this a little more accessible for family members to directly go to the court. And this, our amendment would allow family members to go directly to the court. But there's a slight change. Well, actually, it's probably a big change from what we received from healthcare. To receive an emergency order, what's called an ex parte order, which means that the person who would be subject to the order does not have to be present in court. The standard of proof is called preponderance of evidence. It's a lower standard of proof. And if that ex parte order is issued, within 14 days, there has to be notice and opportunity for another hearing that includes the individual against whom that order is issued. So that's for due process purposes. And it's understood that this comports with due process. But when you get to that final, what I'll call the final extreme risk protection order, which can be issued for up to 6 months, it's a clear and convincing evidence standard, which is a high standard in a civil process. And lay people being able to meet that standard would be very difficult. So what we've done is once it gets past that ex parte or emergency order process, the state's attorney or attorney general would be substituted as the party to pursue a final extreme risk protection order. We think that also protects the due process as well. And law enforcement and state's attorneys will already be involved. If somebody gets an ex parte order, state's attorneys and law enforcement will get involved in the process of getting the relinquished weapon. So that's that change. The final change I will mention, and there's some other grammatical changes throughout the bill as well. But the last one is that with respect to gun shows, we are, and the waiting period. So gun shows usually are over a weekend. The waiting period is 72 hours. So transactions at gun shows would not be able to be completed at a gun show. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be a transaction and a firearm could be mailed to the federally licensed firearm dealer near the person who had purchased this, but that adds an additional cost as well. We've exempted the gun shows from the 72-hour waiting period until July of next year of 2024. This will give us time, and I've already put in a bill request to look at some form of firearm owner ID system. So an individual can show that they own a firearm already. So should they really be subject to a 72-hour waiting period? And we'll look at that question as well, whether they should be. My initial inclination is they shouldn't be. But we don't have a system that really is effective for showing that somebody has a firearm. And we don't want to encourage people to bring their firearms into these stores to show that they own firearms. So this will give us time to look at that over the next year or so. I think that's about the major changes, and there's a few more, but I will mention those on the floor tomorrow. Any questions? We have the, you can yell at me and
If you want to give a microphone,
that's all right.
they're talking.
Thank you, Hannah. Sorry. Hi, Julia Andrews. My question was, could you tell me a little bit about who you took testimony from in addition to the Attorney General on the constitutionality? Just because I'm anticipating that question coming to me this weekend at a community conversation. Thank you.
Sure. We took some, I thought, very good testimony from an attorney in Burlington. He used to work at one of the law firms in Burlington, but is now working for Giffords. I can't remember the full name of the Giffords organization, Giffords for Law Policy, something like that. In any event, a major national organization promoting various firearm violence initiatives. So we also had very good, important testimony from legislative counsel. Personally, I read a lot of cases, but I didn't testify, but I did bring myself up to speed on the issues. And state's attorney, I don't think state's attorney really weighed in on the constitutionality, but they didn't seem to have a problem with the bill. I don't know if that's enough, but.
Hi, Jonathan Williams, Berry City. I am just curious. I'm supportive of the bill, but I am concerned about the lack of a fee or a fine, rather, for storage at home, that being removed. Could you provide a little more detail about the penalties involved if the weapon is used in some sort of malfeasant way? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So if an unsecured firearm is accessed by a child or a prohibited person, and it's used in the commission of a crime, or if it's used in a threatening manner, that would be a 1-year misdemeanor. I think it's a $5,000 fine, but it's the time frame which is more important. And if it is used to cause serious bodily injury or death, that would be a 5-year felony.
Kurt Taylor, Colchester. The constitutionality issue, is that national or state that you're getting most of the questions on?
We had testimony both on the Second Amendment, which is national, and also on Article 16, which is in the Vermont Constitution and guarantees a right to bear arms for self-defense. So we've heard on both. The standard that the Vermont Supreme Court actually just a couple years ago was the first time they really went in depth on Article 16. Found that essentially if we're properly exercising our police authority, that a reasonable firearm restriction is going to be constitutional. It's a much easier standard to meet than the federal standard under the Second Amendment. But we did have testimony on that, and I will explain that briefly tomorrow as well. And if people have constitutional issues or concerns, rather than boring everybody, I am happy to chat with you about the constitutionality.
All right, next up, thank you. And as he said, make sure you reach out to a member of, well, on this bill, you can reach out to a member of judiciary or a member. If it's constitutional, it'll have to be reach out to Martin and a member of judiciary. But this bill has been in both committees, healthcare too. So if you have other questions, go to them too. Okay, up now is H480. Emily Kornheiser is going to report on this. It's the property valuation and reappraisal. Modernization, there's the word I needed.
Hey everyone. So I'm going to share with you about a bill that passed out of our committee 1200. So hold your breath for the controversy. But I wanted to tell you about it because it's gone through a few iterations in our committee. It's a committee bill, and you might be getting questions from like your clerk or your town appraiser. Look at all those nods. So biggest picture here is that the vast majority of the bill is a really, really deep dive study. And we're using the word implementation plan because that makes me feel better about it. But an implementation plan is still a study. And what we're asking the Department of Taxes to do is to explore a number of really important issues, sort of problems that have needed solving for quite a while that have reached a head this year. And so they have a number of years to study this issue deeply, and importantly for you and all your constituents, especially your listers and clerks, to get really deep stakeholder engagement as they work through this process. And that's all sort of part of the implementation study plan process that's being laid out over a number of years. In the meantime, we've done a few things to sort of jumpstart the process, and that includes removing the use of the common level of appraisal, the CLA, as a mechanism that causes a requirement to do a new property valuation. Because all throughout the state this last year, many, many communities were ordered to reappraise because of their CLA. Many of those communities that were ordered to reappraise because of their CLA have not reappraised townwide for more than a decade. This is horrible practice, and it is not the fault of any of the communities that haven't done it. It's just become sort of a Vermont state norm to not reappraise until forced to do so. So the other thing this bill does is moves to a requirement that reappraisals need to happen every 6 years as a standard course of practice. We have been sending money to communities for decades in order to support them in this reappraisal process. They need to put that money aside, save it for reappraisal. So towns have money to be doing this. What they don't have is the ability to contract to do it, because all of our tiny towns just don't have enough properties to make themselves attractive to an outside appraisal firm. And that is really a big part of why we're studying this issue. So the problem we're trying to solve, now that I've told you basically what the bill does, which is study how to do all of this stuff much better than we're doing it, require that reappraisals happen every 6 years, and remove the CLA trigger. Been trying not to use the phrase trigger, but I already did it. So if anyone has good synonyms before I do my floor report, happy to hear that. The problem we're trying to solve is threefold. One, if we wait a very long time between reappraisals, we both cause stress to communities when they finally do need to reappraise. Like, for instance, Burlington last year. Everyone remember that? causes big spikes between reappraisals. And that's not really good for the individual people in the community. It's not good for the grand list. It's not good for our statewide education fund. It's why the CLA has so much power as a tool to sort of mitigate all those spikes, but it creates a lot of instability. So we want to reappraise more often, and we haven't been. We have a problem with contracting for reappraisals because we're doing it at such a small scale. So we want to look at how to do it more efficiently. We also heard some really incredible testimony from Susanna Davis about statewide and nationally inconsistencies in how appraisals happen, and how throughout the country, including Vermont, data from Vermont, there is a tendency to appraise lower value homes at a higher rate and higher value homes at a lower rate. And that essentially punishes folks with lower value homes because we still need to raise the same amount of money. There's also a significant amount of implicit bias related to race and class built into all of that, as you might imagine. And so our findings section lays out all of that work that's been done nationally in Vermont around bias in reappraisal system, not purposeful bias. That's what implicit bias means. And the sort of long-standing concerns we've had with instability related to our property reevaluation schedules. So those are the findings. There's a few short-term solutions to stabilize the system. And then we're going to do some deep work on longer-term solutions over the next 5 years with the Department of Taxes for them to look really deeply at consistency in our grand lists. The definition of properties from town to town is different. That's not really helpful for anyone. And we want to make sure that we have regular check-ins on reappraisal so that we don't have big swings from year to year like we've seen the last couple of years. And that's the big exciting committee bill out of Ways and Means this year. And we're moving some money around, but there's no new revenue in the bill or anything like that.
Thank you for that summary. My question is how this bill, whether and how this bill may affect last year's weighting study and the outcomes, knowing that the weighting study had important outcomes that we needed to achieve, but a timeline to help those communities that have been historically been benefiting from the old weighting system.
Is that terrible thing happening on your microphone or my microphone? Okay. They have absolutely no relationship to each other at all. The property valuation division, which is who does this, is not really particularly engaged in weighting. Weighting impacts folks' property tax bill because it's how we count students, and the value of someone's property impacts their property tax bill. But I would say that's like sort of the closest I can get to a nexus between these two issues. The way we actually count poverty or things like that for purposes of weighting is not at all the purview of this bill. That's much more something that sits in the Department of Education, the Agency of Education.
Perhaps I'll clarify that. I think that some of the towns that have been historically benefiting from the weighting, that I agree it needed to be updated, were given a ramping of time to adjust those weights with the anticipated caps on spending. So I think I had perhaps I was wrongly assumed, but I had assumed that there was a connection somehow between that system and the common use of the CL.
No, there's really no relationship between the two bills. This one is like really sort of a technical modernization of some processes. And the other one is really how we determine tax rates for the weighting is how we determine tax rates for communities. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
If you have any questions, make sure you see Representative Kornheiser or anyone on Ways and Means. Okay, up next, we are going to do, Stephanie, are you here? There's a workforce bill right in front of me. that she's going to quickly report on. Representative Jerome, not Stephanie.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. First I wanted to thank, let me start off again. This bill was, we followed up on the bill that we worked on last year, Act 183, which is a huge workforce development bill. And so that was sort of we're stepping off again on building on a lot of the work that we had done last year. So I wanted to thank the committees on healthcare, education, corrections, environment, and human services on working with us on this. It was really important that we worked very closely with those committees to create this bill. So the bill has $40 million worth of workforce and economic development programs, an awful lot of forgivable loans and grants. But let me just start off with first section. So we have teacher forgivable loans and grants, as well as a sort of grow your own program, and also a mentoring program for diverse teachers, BIPOC community, and so to help keep grow our education workforce and keep our teachers teaching in Vermont public schools. There is a section on adult skills, and so a significant amount of money went to Vermont Serve and Learn, which is an interesting cooperative group of nonprofits, including Vermont Works for Women, Audubon, Resource Vermont, and Youth Conservation Corps, to train adult learners and getting new skills and certifications. We put some money towards adult education and literacy. Then there's a unique program that we started last year, and this will be the second year, utilizing the Office of Engagement at UVM to entice all Vermont graduates, so with a bachelor's degree that have attended either public or private schools, to stay and work for companies in Vermont. And this is an initiative to try to grow our younger population and to work for companies that have great jobs, and for people who have already been in the state for 4 years and know and appreciate living in Vermont. And then we have some restorative justice BA at Vermont State Colleges, a number of programs for Vermont State Colleges, including a 6-week 3D technology program for high school and recent graduates. There's a critical occupation scholarship. There's Upskill Vermont scholarships, which are from UVM. The critical occupations is for scholarships out of Vermont State Colleges, Vermont trade scholarships. There's $5 million going towards the Vermont training program. So that would be the match for the CHIPS Act, which could be as much as $500 million coming to Vermont to create some microchips, semiconductors. And then a lot of money going towards mental health professionals. So there's a forgivable loan program for psychiatric mental health nurse practitioners. There's some additional loan and grant programs for mental health professionals. And then there's also nursing forgivable loan programs, and an EMS, $1 million going to EMS training. We know that's a big shortage in Vermont as well. And then there's an uplifting of for economic development. We have, during pandemic, we started a program which was highly successful, which the development corporations, regional development corporations spearheaded, as well as some other organizations, to help small businesses with their whatever small business needs they had, whether that be accounting or getting better accounting practices, whether it was creating a website, whether it was human resources skills, whether it was marketing skills. So we're building on what we learned during the pandemic, and I'm going to continue that program through the RDCs. Then there's $10 million for brownfield cleanup. We know that's very important for economic development. And then there's $5 million going towards a rural industry development fund, which would help the permitting process and sort of get things sped up a little bit when we know that there are businesses that want to take, for the most part, either existing buildings and industrial buildings or industrial areas that are deemed industrial, manufacturing and to get those off on the right foot. So anyway, that is sort of on the nutshell. We've got broad healthcare, education, and workforce grants, incentives, and loans, as well as economic development programs. Thank you.
Can you say a little more about the Emerging Pathways program? I'm not sure what that really is.
So that's the build your own program. Is that what you're talking for education? Yeah. Yeah. So if there's someone who wants to talk from education, who want to talk a little bit more about that, they can. But my understanding is that it is taking a workforce. We did something similarly with the healthcare workforce last year. So we building up teachers, professionals, or workers who are already in the school setting. Maybe Erin, you want to talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. This is specifically programs to help folks go through the mostly, not entirely, but mostly go through the peer review process to licensure for teaching, which is a really cumbersome, inexpensive process. And it's being used currently in our state, particularly in the Northeast Kingdom, as a kind of stopgap way to address a serious teacher shortage and try to upskill paraprofessionals and folks who are really rooted in that community, so likely to stay there if they can get the training and then become fully licensed teachers. We have a small program that's operating in the Northeast Kingdom now that's quite successful. The NEA is running that one, but the goal here is to create a few other programs around the state that can meet local needs and areas and try to bring folks into the teacher workforce through that kind of a pathway. Most of it's peer review. It's possible there would be some other kind of hybrid things developed depending on the community, but mostly we're talking about the peer review process.
Thank you. And like I said, we had a great model in the healthcare system doing very similar idea of building up our workforce that was already committed to this sector. Thanks.
Okay, we're gonna quick move on. We got two more quick ones and then two more little longer ones. Representative Baumgartz, do you want to come up and just do a quick update? I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware because there've been a little pushback and a change of a bill, H31, which is the aquatic nuisance control, and there's been a little change that we want to make sure everybody knows about.
Hi, everybody. Just very quickly, as many of you are probably aware, there has been controversy generated around Lake Bomazene and an application to use chemicals to control Eurasian milfoil. And by its nature, the notion of putting chemicals in our waters is controversial and actually probably should be controversial. And so with that as a starting point and with also a recognition that there has historically been a lot of conflict between DEC, which issued Department of Environmental Conservation, which issues the permit, and Fish and Wildlife, which has very frequently opposed the issuance of permits because of the impact on fish and aquatic biota, habitat. And they have frequently, not always, and they say it's getting better, which I'll buy into that, maybe getting better, but Fish and Wildlife has frequently been ignored. And the permit's simply been issued despite opposition from Fish and Wildlife. So we have an inherent we have a problem. And the law was this iteration of the law governing how it works was last amended in 2009. Since then, our awareness of the danger of chemicals has only grown. And there's other things in the statute that the way it's written, it's like the starting point is yes, if you can. And so the original bill had a moratorium, kind of a little bit of alarm about this situation and the fact that it was going on, and a moratorium and a study. We took a lot of testimony in my committee last week, and some really good testimony, and it convinced us, and even me as the sponsor of the bill, that a blanket moratorium is not a good idea. That's the way the committee process is supposed to work, and it worked really well. So we ended up realizing that what really matters is the study, and the study then making recommendations to the committee next year about how to restructure the bill, how to set the starting point for this, and how to resolve, let's say, that conflict between Fish and Wildlife and DEC. And the more we took testimony, I think it's fair to say, the more we realized it may not be like just DEC not respecting Fish and Wildlife. The real problem is the statute. And so we really need to take a deep dive into the statute, get this right before we continue putting chemicals into the waters of the state of Vermont. So, but we did decide that the moratorium, we've had this little bill that we thought we were going to do in a few hours, that turned out to be a little more controversial than we had anticipated. But that's okay, because we got really good testimony and decided that the moratorium was in fact not a good idea. So the bill now is just that summer study, 2 people from the House, 2 from the Senate, scientists from Fish and Wildlife, scientists from DEC, and somebody from the Department of Health. So meet over the summer and take a look at the whole thing and come with recommendations to the committee on, I was going to say natural resources, environment and energy, and the counterpart in the Senate. So it's been reduced to a study, but the committee's happy with that. Thanks.
If anyone has any questions on that, on H31 or what you just heard, please get a hold of Representative Bongartz or anyone on energy, environment and energy. And I should have said the same thing about the workforce bill. If you have questions, make sure you see Representative Jerome or someone on Commerce. Okay, next up, I have Lucy Boyden, Representative Boyden, who's going to speak about H476. All right, Gavaz.
Hi, I'll keep this quick, but H476 is an act relating to miscellaneous changes to law enforcement officer training laws. This bill would implement recommendations from the 2022 Domestic Violence Fatality Review Commission report. And so there's 5 sections within the bill, but I'm just going to focus on section 3 and section 4, as you'll hear my full walkthrough tomorrow on the floor. So section 3 amends 20 VSA 2401 definitions for law enforcement officer certification and Vermont Criminal Justice Council structure to include 2 new subdivisions to category B conduct. So category B conduct means gross professional misconduct amounting to actions on duty or under authority of the state or both that involve willful failure to comply with a state required policy or a substantial deviation from professional conduct as defined by the law enforcement agency's policy, or if not defined by the agency's policy, then as defined by council policy. So new subdivision 2H includes while on or off duty, attempting to cause or causing physical harm to a family member or household member, or placing a family or household member in fear of imminent serious physical harm. New subdivision 2I includes while on duty or off duty, a violation of domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy. Section 4 amends category B conduct that is allowed for action to be taken on a first offense based on a valid investigation of a complaint to include the 2 previous subdivisions that I just stated. The bill passed out of the House Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee on a vote of 11-01, and we request your support.
Thank you. Representative Robin Chestnut, Tangerman. Does this bill address sheriffs and sheriff's deputies at all, or is it only municipal and state law enforcement?
I'm going to yield to the member from St. Albans City.
So thank you very much, Representative Boyden. That's a great question. So this applies to all law enforcement. So I think it's important for everybody to keep in mind with this bill, and I think it's H482. It just got a number today. The bill we passed out on Friday. Those both have to do with the Criminal Justice Council, and both have to do with how we're modernizing, updating, and strengthening both training and accountability at the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. All of these changes that we make with category B conduct and the other conduct that's listed as things that the Criminal Justice Council can take action on and sanction, suspend or decertify a law enforcement officer, all of those changes apply to every single law enforcement officer in the state. So Vermont has one law enforcement certification authority through the Criminal Justice Council. We have one academy. So all law enforcement certification, whether it's a constable, a deputy, a sheriff, Vermont state trooper, fish and wildlife, DLL enforcement, it's all one certification. So it applies to all law enforcement officers. That's a great question.
Come on down. Oh, sorry. I might have missed this, or this is probably an easy one. What's category B conduct?
Yeah, so Criminal Justice Council has essentially three levels of conduct. Category A is really obvious because those are mostly criminal charges. And I think they're all felonies if I can remember, but most of our policy work has been focused on category B, so this professional misconduct. And what's interesting is that we already have the structure where some of the category B conducts can only be acted on the second time that there's a complaint. So an officer kind of gets like one mulligan. And then other things that we've identified as being more serious, we've referred to them in shorthand as like B+ offenses, are things that are so serious that we feel like we need the Criminal Justice Council to act on the first time. And what Representative Boyden was just summarizing was that these two domestic violence related additional category B conduct definitions that we've added with this bill, those will both be actionable on the first time. I think in the context of our future work, as we look at sheriffs and other things, we may take up the request that we heard from Chair Sorrell and the Criminal Justice Council to have all category B conduct be actionable on the first offense if they deem at their discretion, but we haven't gone that far yet, but we have included these two DV related conduct definitions as actionable on the first complaint.
Thank you, Representative Boyden and Representative McCarthy and all of GovOps. If you have questions, go to them. All right, we have two bills left. I'll just say what both of them are so you'll know you're staying in your seats. We have Representative Conlon. I'm going to have you come up next on the education bill, and then we're going to have Representative Whitman come up on the opioid bill, H222. So go first.
Hi, everybody. Peter Conlon from the House Education Committee, here to talk about H483, just introduced today. 483 is the result of a lot of work in the beginning of the session on the House Education Committee's part, spurred originally by this summer's Supreme Court decision called Carson v. Macon, which held that in the state of Maine, they have a town tuitioning system not dissimilar to Vermont's. And the Supreme Court basically said, you're not compelled to have a tuitioning system, but if you do, you can't discriminate against religious schools for who is awarded those funds. Vermont has a similar system. Guidance came down from the Agency of Education telling school districts that if they're in a choice town and parents request to send their children to an approved independent school that is religiously affiliated, that can no longer be blocked. This, of course, sets up a constitutional conflict between the Supreme Court and Vermont's own constitution with its compelled support clause, saying that you can't be compelled to support one religion or another. So that prompted for us a deep dive, and the bill that is 483. It does not solve the constitutional crisis here, but it did bring to light a lot about our town tuitioning system that really hadn't been looked at by the legislature, at least during my time. And it brought forth just some issues that we felt could be corrected, improved, modified. You know, you got to remember, I just want to say that what I'm talking about here are approved independent schools that are eligible to take public dollars and students who choose to go to them at taxpayers' expense. So this is all about public school or public dollars that are using to pay tuition to kids at schools that are approved to accept those dollars. And this is not about what we call therapeutic schools, or those schools that are essentially independent schools, but really serve a client base that are strictly students that are on individual education programs. So, we learned a lot. I mean, we had a lot of testimony from superintendents who basically said, we send our kids off to 13 different schools through school choice. And at that point, we lose track of them. We don't really get a lot of information about them after that. So that's just an example of some of the things that we are addressing and that we heard. So this bill sets forth some new conditions for both approved independent schools eligible to receive public tuition. I'm just going to refer to them as approved independent schools. And in some cases, public schools, which also accept students that are being tuitioned in. Probably first and foremost and most important is discrimination. So this bill requires that any school that seeks to be approved to accept public dollars must comply with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act, which means that generally means businesses and how they deal with customers, but this is really about students. And it says that, you can't discriminate against any student based on the protected classes. In addition, it also requires adherence to the Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act, which talks about discrimination in employment matters, although there is a ministerial exemption in that. Some of the smaller areas that we also got into is to really have independent schools, the Agency of Education, and what we call local education agencies, our school districts, work together to come up with systems for regular reporting on attendance, on enrollment status, and probably more importantly than anything, academic progress. As I said, we had a lot of superintendents tell us there isn't really one good system in place that allows for them to know what's going on. Ultimately, the superintendents or the local education agencies, they're the ones ultimately responsible for the education of all of the students in their district. And in cases of choice towns, they are relying on those schools that they tuition their students to handle that. In addition to that, we have some reporting requirements on tuition, that tuition at a approved independent school cannot be lower for private pay students than it is for public paying students, that tuition dollars collected from public pay students can't be used to subsidize the tuition of private pay students. It calls for a student advocate or an advocate at the Agency of Education. We've asked the agency to see if this can be assigned to somebody already working there or to create a position for it. There would be basically an ombudsman for a student attending on public dollars, a school that's not in their district. Usually these schools don't have districts, but gives them a place to go to at the AOE if there is a complaint or an issue, so that it provides kind of a one-stop shop for dealing with those. It also has new requirements over admissions. We have rules governing admissions, and this adds to those that essentially, to put it in blunt terms, says that if you're an independent school choosing to take public dollar students, you don't get to pick and choose which public dollar students you enroll. It certainly allows an independent school to meet with those students at the students choosing or the parents choosing. Doesn't prohibit that, but it's not to be used as part of the admissions process. And certainly after enrollment, whatever meetings can take place can and will take place. It also includes a 25-mile border around the state that says that public dollars can't travel more than 25 miles beyond the state of Vermont. In the bill as we have it, it talks about states, doesn't talk about the province of Canada. We have a committee bill that I'll be introducing that speaks to some of that, which I'll talk about in just a second. And this would also include an exception for those students who are already enrolled in a school that may be beyond those distances. It also includes a moratorium until the General Assembly decides otherwise, that no new initial approvals for independent schools seeking to receive public dollars be approved. This was really never meant to be a growth industry. And so this moratorium is in place until the legislature decides otherwise. in order to give more time to kind of look the system over, see what capacities are, and decide what the system's going to look like in the future. So we do have a committee bill that we're going to be working on this afternoon. It would add Canada to that 25-mile radius. It also assures that language for admittance for tuition students to public schools is equal to those or more strict, in fact, to private schools. One thing we discovered is that while the practice of public schools is pretty clear, they accept anyone who seeks tuition if there's space, because otherwise they could be sued. The policies are not crystal clear. And so this seeks to also clear up some of those policies and make sure that the policies between an approved independent school receiving public dollars and a public school are equal. Some of the other parts in the amendment will be more clarifying that we sort of discovered after the bill went to press. We forgot to cut out a part that should have been cut out. There's some conforming language, and we always have to use the word approved independent school eligible to receive public tuition, and we left out the words eligible to receive public tuition in a few areas. That about covers it. Like everybody else says, so it's a bill with a lot there, and I and other members of the Education Committee are happy to talk with folks about it informally.
Peter, where do we stand right now on the selection of 3 schools for school choice towns? I haven't heard you mention that, and I'm wondering where that is.
Sure, that was a provision in H258. This is not H258. This does not limit choice except to an approved independent school eligible to receive public dollars.
Anybody has any questions, please come on up, Representative. If you have questions, please reach out to Representative Conlon or anyone on education. I want to make sure you're ready for that. And last, but certainly not least, and my apologies for being so late and at the end, but somebody had to be at the end. You will not be next time. This is on, oh gosh, H222, which is the opioid response bill, and Representative Wood's going to give you a rundown on it.
Everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Dane Whitman, representative from Bennington, and I'm presenting on H222, act relating to reducing overdoses. It was passed out of committee on Friday, and now it's in the Ways and Means Committee. This is not a simple bill. It has a lot of sections, and I'll do my best to provide kind of necessary background information, since not everybody might be super familiar with the topics that we discuss, while also trying to be brief in my overview so you can all get back to committee. So I'd like to start by setting the context that the Department of Health's latest monthly opioid fatality report has indicated that 2022 is more than likely to be our 3rd subsequent record-breaking year for fatal overdose, with 237 opioid-related accidental and undetermined deaths among Vermont residents and 24 pending death certificates. I'll say from past years' experience that the number of confirmed deaths tends to increase as the data flows in, so that number is not final. I also want to say that when we worked on this bill and with the approach in our systems, it's more than just opioids. We also look at xylazine, the increased prevalence of stimulants, and alcohol and other substances are all addressed with our substance use disorder system. So it goes without saying that these deaths are tragic, especially in that they're preventable. And while we can't help the Vermonters that we have already lost, we can make a positive difference in the lives of the tens of thousands of Vermonters who are living with substance use disorder in our state, whether they're in treatment, recovery, struggling with an addiction, or a family member of somebody at risk. So I'm going to walk through the bill kind of out of order because I think certain sections help provide context for others. And I also just want to place the bill against the backdrop of the roughly $8 million in investments recommended by the Opioid Settlement Advisory Committee for this year, as well as the additional investments we're looking at within our budget big bill. So I'm not going to talk about those funding today, but those are there. Just going to talk about the policy proposals within H222. So the first policy area has to do with removing the removal of a law related to criminal penalties for buprenorphine. So 2 years ago, the legislature passed a law to remove criminal penalties for unprescribed buprenorphine for a personal use amount if you are 21 years or older. The Senate added a sunset provision to this bill, meaning that the law would expire this summer if no action was taken. H222 removes this sunset provision and would make that policy permanent. So for those of you who don't know what buprenorphine is, it's a medication used in the treatment of opioid use disorder. Folks may know it by its common name brand, Suboxone. And it's important to know what it is that we're removing criminal penalties for. It's a partial agonist, partial opioid agonist, which means it activates some opioid receptors just enough to satisfy cravings and reduce symptoms of withdrawal, and it blocks others, meaning that it's near impossible to overdose on buprenorphine, or even other opioids such as heroin or fentanyl if buprenorphine is in your system. Sticking together. So Vermont was the first state in the country to pass this removal of criminal penalties. And since then, Johns Hopkins University has done a study on our work, which they presented to the committee. And they surveyed both providers and people accessing treatment. And what they found is that the main reason people had used unprescribed buprenorphine was to manage their withdrawal symptoms, was to satisfy cravings, or it was due to gaps within the treatment system. People leaving corrections or people leaving inpatient residential treatment and having an interruption in getting their prescription would use unprescribed buprenorphine from a friend or buy it off the street. So essentially, we also know that the use of unprescribed buprenorphine was often a precursor for people engaging in treatment themselves and getting a prescription. And that overall providers and people with substance use disorder were greatly in support of this policy that made it so it's not a misdemeanor penalty to be in possession. The next section of the bill that I'm going to talk about addresses zoning barriers for recovery residences. For some context, current law provides that a group home with 8 beds or less serving people with disabilities shall fit a permitted use of a single family dwelling. And recovery homes don't currently fit in this description for the simple reason that they're not licensed by the state. So now one thing that we learned in trying to create this extended use to recovery homes is that recovery residences did not have a definition in state law. So we were fortunate enough to be able to create that definition. So what this is going to do is basically avoid prolonged, legal battles that ultimately determine that recovery homes are a permitted single family use. That's what we've been seeing a lot of. And it will address our desperate need for expanded capacity for recovery homes. Most people, when they leave inpatient treatment for substance use disorder, are looking for a supportive living arrangement that will sort of provide resources for their ongoing recovery. And currently, too many Vermonters are met with wait lists for recovery housing and need to return to environments that may put them at greater risk for relapse. So the next part of our bill covers prior authorization for medications in the treatment of opioid use disorder. Prior authorizations, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is essentially a process by which an insurance agency double checks the prescribing practices of a provider. For a provider, this usually looks like extra paperwork, and for a person seeking treatment, this might be a delay in having your prescription. anywhere from 30 minutes to the worst case of 72 hours is kind of the most that we would see, or even worse, a denial of your prescription. So now there's maybe an argument that there's a clinical reason for prior authorization, but I think the House Human Services Committee found that prior authorization has a lot to do with money. And this is evidenced by the fact that the Department of Vermont Health Access incentivizes the use of certain medications, such as name brand Suboxone, by giving them exemptions from prior authorization. So you might think to yourself, why do we incentivize the use of a name brand as opposed to a generic product? And this is because DVA essentially makes deals with drug manufacturers. The state of Vermont makes deals with drug manufacturers that in return for making one product our preferred medication, the state receives a supplemental rebate, a cash kickback every time that we prescribe that medication. So while many members of the House Human Services Committee would like to get rid of this process altogether, we have received concerns that there could be a significant price to not receiving those supplemental rebates that could equal the equivalent of at least half, if not all, of our opioid settlement dollars, for example. So at least this year, we're taking a targeted approach to addressing prior authorization. And the two things that we're doing is addressing dosage limits and a process called MedWatch. So MedWatch, I'll kind of try to describe in a hypothetical. So let's imagine that I have opioid use disorder. I've tried buprenorphine that was not prescribed to me, and now I'm ready to engage in formal treatment. I go to a provider, and their first response is to prescribe Suboxone, the preferred medication. But I'm able to tell my provider that actually I've taken Suboxone before and it made me sick. Maybe it gave me a bad rash. Maybe it made me vomit. It gave me an adverse reaction that I know I'm essentially allergic to Suboxone. And actually, I've tried an alternative, Zubsolv, for example, and that different formulation of buprenorphine works a lot better for me. I'd prefer that. Well, DVA's current prior authorization process says that the doctor has to essentially say, I'm sorry, Suboxone's the preferred medication. What I need you to do is take this Suboxone in front of me that you just told me would make you vomit, and I'll document the adverse reaction, and I'll try to prescribe you medications that alleviate the symptoms. And only if that doesn't work, then I'll prescribe you the Zubsolv that you asked for. Yes, this does actually happen. We heard testimony of conflict in providers' offices, people leaving the office, vomiting in the parking lot, developing rashes that needed to be photographed and sent along. And it's just, it's a traumatizing practice. It's dehumanizing, and so we're going to prohibit that within H222. Another piece of our work on prior authorization is addressing a somewhat arbitrary state-imposed disparity between hubs and spokes for the limit of prescribing buprenorphine. Hubs are allowed to prescribe buprenorphine at 24 milligrams, and there's far less hubs in the state than there are spokes, whereas spokes are capped at 16 milligrams before requiring, and anything higher than 16 milligrams from a spoke provider, you have to go through prior auth, at which point you'd need to present things like your analysis, evidence of pill counts, additional paperwork, things like that. And so in an effort to remove that barrier, we've directed DVA to amend its rules to allow spokes to prescribe up to 24 milligrams of buprenorphine as well. We're finding this could be especially important as the drug supply is becoming more potent and people may need higher dosages of treatment. So we're also providing further updates to our statute on rulemaking for treatment in general to make it less prescriptive, adding flexibility to rulemaking. We're making permanent our COVID-19 era flexibilities so that medications for opioid use disorder can be prescribed via telehealth to the extent permitted under federal requirements, which are kind of a moving target coming out of COVID-19. And this is a telehealth prescriptions is obviously a huge deal to improve access to treatment despite transportation or geographic barriers to a provider. We also address syringe disposal within this bill. This was actually brought to my attention last year when we passed a bill on prescription drug disposal, and Representative Kornheiser asked me, what about syringes? And we started exploring the issue, and what I learned is that the current Department of Health guidelines for syringe disposal goes kind of as follows. Put on a pair of, if you find a syringe in the street, or if you need to dispose of it, put on a pair of garden gloves, grab a pair of pliers, put the syringe into an empty laundry detergent bottle, duct tape the cap onto the bottle, and write "do not recycle" on that bottle, and throw it into the trash. I think that reading that for the first time, I thought we could probably do better in the state of Vermont. So our goal is to improve access to syringe disposal statewide. However, we heard testimony that there's really not a one-size-fits-all solution. The best location for a syringe disposal kiosk could be very specific to a community. So we set up a sort of statewide stakeholder engagement process with the Department of Health, Blueprint for Health, and we've created a grant funded through a special fund available to communities that participated in that process. Another component of the bill is updating a fee in a Medicaid rebate program. This is a fee on pharmaceutical manufacturers that feeds a fund called the Evidence-Based Education and Advertising Fund. This is actually the same fund we're hoping to provide the grants for syringe disposal. The fund's also used for things like substance use disorder prevention work, prescription drug disposal, and purchasing Narcan and opioid reversal drug. So this fund was established in 2007. The fee hasn't been increased in 8 years. We're hoping that by updating this fee, we can move closer to fill the extensive need for funding resources within our substance use disorder continuum of services. Which is a good segue to the next part of the bill on a statewide assessment of our syringe exchange services. So syringe exchange programs or syringe service programs, these are organizations that won't only take your used syringe, but they'll provide you a sterile syringe in return, as well as other harm reduction supplies, case management services, Narcan. And there's robust evidence that this is a great public health tool. However, we know that there's pretty spotty distribution of these services throughout the state. So we've asked the Department of Health to make an assessment on the feasibility and costs of fully funding equitable statewide access to syringe services. And this would be in consultation with providers, people with lived experience, et cetera. Next, our Narcan statute in the state is about 8 years old. And we updated the statute to reflect current practice, be far less restrictive about who should have access to Narcan, training, education to Narcan. And we also took a step forward to create room for innovative means of distributing Narcan to the public that we're beginning to see, things like Narcan vending machines, wall-mounted naloxone boxes that sort of might resemble a wall-mounted defibrillator that you see in businesses and such. And on to the next section, we're updating our statute on drug paraphernalia. This was actually a policy we had in last year's bill, H728, and it's based on the fact that syringe service programs are not fully exempted to do what they do under current Vermont law. A lot of their other harm reduction supplies would still be considered drug paraphernalia. So we're updating it so that things that they distribute, such as fentanyl test strips, Narcan, et cetera, also fit under the definition of exemptions for drug paraphernalia. So a lot of stuff in this bill. I want to acknowledge that our work is far from over, even with this. I know there's a lot of interest in innovative policies, but it was humbling experience just seeing how much catch-up work we have to do as a state to remove stigma, remove unnecessary barriers from our substance use disorder treatment system. So there's a lot of work to ensure equitable access to the services we already have. And I believe H222 takes a big step. Thanks everybody who co-sponsored it. Thank you to Democratic leadership for sponsoring it as well, and to continue centering saving lives as a priority.
I'm Rep. Austin from Colchester. I'm just wondering if there are any restrictions to operating a motor vehicle under the use of, if there's a level or, if it impacts driving.
Yeah, I would say that we didn't really take too much testimony as far as driving under the influence of buprenorphine. This mostly just related to possession.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that update for us. This is on the floor. Okay, so it's not immediately on the floor, but pay close attention. And if you have any questions, please reach out to Representative Whitman or anyone on the committee. I know everybody's got to run off to committees that really appreciate this important bill and all the other ones that we talked about today. So thank you, everyone. Have a great